Have you ever wondered why the world abandoned the gold standard so suddenly? Why a monetary system that had been the backbone of global finance for centuries was dropped almost overnight? And why so many history books seem to skip past the deeper political motivations behind that moment? Was it really just economic pressure? Or was something far more strategic happening behind the scenes? What secret negotiations took place in private rooms that we rarely hear about today? In this video, we're going to learn everything. We're going to break down the secret deal that reshaped the world's financial future and changed how money works forever. So let's start. To understand how the gold standard really died, you first need to know what made it so powerful. For centuries, gold wasn't just a shiny metal, it was trust. When a government issued its currency, people believed in it because they knew it was backed by something real, something tangible, something universally valuable. Under the gold standard, a country could only print as much money as it had gold stored in its vaults. That meant governments had limits. They couldn't overspend, they couldn't borrow endlessly, and they couldn't inflate their currency whenever they felt like it. Money had discipline. But discipline comes with trade-offs. The gold standard made international trade stable and predictable. Yes, but it also restricted governments from responding quickly to economic shocks. If a crisis hit, or if a nation needed to invest heavily in infrastructure or military power, the gold standard acted like a hard ceiling. And as the world became more complex in the 20th century, that ceiling became a problem, especially for a rising superpower like the United States. After World War II, the US controlled more than 2/3 of the world's gold. American factories were booming, the dollar was strong, and countries around the world trusted the US financial system. So in 1944, world leaders met in a place called Bretton Woods and created a new global monetary system. Currencies around the world were linked to the US dollar. And the US dollar was linked to gold at a fixed price, $35 per ounce. On paper, this created stability. In reality, it placed a huge responsibility on the US and an even bigger temptation. As the Cold War intensified, the United States needed money, a lot of money. Funding the Vietnam War, supporting allies around the world, maintaining military bases everywhere, and financing domestic programs created enormous financial pressure. But under the gold standard, the US couldn't simply print dollars unless it had gold to back them. And rather than cut spending, the US chose another path. It printed more dollars anyway. At first, nobody noticed. But by the early 1960s, countries like France, Germany, and Japan were becoming economic powerhouses. They were exporting goods, accumulating dollars, and looking closely at the US balance sheet. And what they saw worried them. America was issuing more dollars than it had gold to redeem. In simple terms, the US was promising more gold than it physically possessed. Foreign governments began to ask a dangerous question. Can the United States actually pay what it owes? Some didn't just ask, they acted. France, led by President Charles de Gaulle, openly accused the US of abusing its privilege. In 1965, France even sent a battleship to New York to collect its gold reserves. This was not a symbolic gesture, it was a global embarrassment for Washington. And it signaled that the gold standard was in deep trouble. Still, publicly, the US insisted everything was fine. Privately, American officials were panicking. By the end of the 1960s, for every ounce of gold the US held, there were nearly $3 claiming to be worth that ounce. If countries demanded their gold all at once, the entire system would collapse. The US needed a plan and fast. This is where the story gets interesting. Because most people think the end of the gold standard was a sudden decision made by President Richard Nixon in August 1971. But the truth is, the real decision happened months earlier in quiet, closed-door meetings. Throughout early 1971, the United States held secret discussions with the United Kingdom, Japan, West Germany, and influential financial institutions. These conversations were not public. They were private strategy sessions designed to answer a single question. How do we get off the gold standard without causing global panic? And here's the twist: many countries quietly supported the idea. Not because they trusted the US, but because they realized something important. A world without gold would give them more freedom too. Governments could stimulate their economies, adjust their currencies, and spend more without worrying about gold reserves. Central banks loved the idea as well. It gave them more control than ever before. Still, there was resistance, especially from France. But the reality was undeniable. Staying on the gold standard meant tying their economies to U.S. financial decisions. The global structure was breaking, and everyone knew it. So, behind the scenes, a loose agreement began to form. The world would move away from gold, the public wouldn't know the details, and the transition would be framed as temporary, necessary, and unavoidable. That brings us to August 15, 1971. President Nixon appeared on national television and delivered what became known as the Nixon shock. He told Americans he was temporarily suspending the dollar's convertibility into gold. He blamed international speculators. He used patriotic language. And he assured everyone that this was only a temporary move to protect the economy. But none of that was true. The U.S. wasn't reacting to sudden attacks on the dollar, was executing a plan months in the making. And the suspension was never temporary. The real reasons behind Nixon's announcement were simple. The U.S. was losing gold fast. It wanted full control over its own monetary policy. And it needed a way to finance its political and military ambitions without constraints. Ending the gold standard gave Washington everything it wanted. The consequences were immediate. Other countries realized the gold link was gone and shifted to floating exchange rates. Currencies began to rise and fall based on markets instead of fixed gold values. Central banks gained immense power to influence their economies. Governments could borrow more, spend more, and stimulate growth in ways that were impossible under the old system. But this new world came with a cost. Inflation exploded in the 1970s. Gold, once fixed at $35 an ounce, shot up to over $800. Global debt began a long, unstoppable climb. Wealth inequality widened as financial markets surged. Asset bubbles became more common. And we entered an era where money was no longer tied to something real, but to political decisions and central bank policies. Despite all of this, most history books give only a simplified explanation. They say the gold standard ended because it was outdated or inflexible. They rarely discuss the behind-the-scenes negotiations, the political motivations, the geopolitical strategy, or the coordinated exit that world leaders quietly agreed upon. They ignore how the system failed, not because of economic theory, but because of political ambition. And that leads to the biggest question of all: did we lose something valuable when we abandoned the gold standard? Some economists say yes. The gold standard forced discipline. It kept governments honest. It prevented runaway inflation and limited reckless borrowing. Others say no, the modern world needed flexibility, and the gold standard was too rigid for a complex global economy. What's clear is this: when a handful of leaders decided to disconnect money from gold, they fundamentally changed how the world works. They shifted power toward central banks, allowed governments to accumulate massive debt, and created a financial system that runs on confidence rather than tangible value. And that's the secret deal history books rarely talk about. The gold standard didn't collapse on its own, it was quietly taken apart, intentionally, by people who believed they were shaping a more flexible and powerful economic system. Whether they succeeded is still up for debate.